This weekend, millions of Americans will use the occasion of a federal holiday for all sorts of recreational activity, most likely not caring about the whys and the wherefores. This isn't to condemn a good time, it is to revisit the whys and the wherefores. If pressed on the reason for the holiday, one may say they are celebrating our independence from England, but that's probably the only consideration given to the idea. If an American could compare the liberties he enjoys with those of a pre Revolutionary War colonist, he might well wish to find the nearest time machine and switch shoes. And wearing those shoes, perhaps he would have opportunity to read the words of Thomas Jefferson with the ink barely dry on the Declaration of Independence. And he said, quote, "The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in a direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states." In penning these words, Jefferson became the liar of the century. His assessment was verifiably false, yet his words have had resounding historical impact. The colonists actually had a really sweet deal, particularly with taxation. The total burden of British imperial taxation was about 1% of national income and no higher than 2.5% in the southern colonies. 2.5%. How'd you like that rate now, American? That would be a blessing. In 1775, it would have been harder to find a freer nation on earth than Great Britain. And in the British Empire, the colonists were by far the freest. Today's Americans who believe they enjoy freedoms would be shell shocked if they were transported back to 1775. Unless they were a slave, they would be living in the freest nation on earth, British North America. Generally, the colonists bought what the Continental Congress was selling when they declared independence on July the 2nd of 1776. But they were clueless as to what they were about to lose. They would soon pay a price in blood, treasure, and debt. Just 7 years after the Declaration was signed, tax rates had tripled. In his great book about taxation in the colonies, historian Alvin Babushka writes this, quote, "Historians have written that taxes in the new American nation rose and remained considerably higher, perhaps 3 times higher than they were under British rule. More money was required for national defense than previously needed to defend the frontier from Indians and the French, and the new nation faced other expenses," unquote. By signing the Declaration of Independence, the colonists were now exposed to what they had not been exposed to prior to July the 2nd, 1776, British tyranny, something which did not exist in North America on July the 1st, 1776. As Al Pacino might say in Sin of a Woman, "You want tyranny? I'll show you tyranny." After the American Revolution, 46,000 American loyalists fled to Canada. They were not willing to swear allegiance to the new colonial government. They retained their loyalty to the nation that had delivered to them the greatest liberty on earth. They had not committed treason. Why would they? Nobody views the signers as treasonous. As Sir John Harrington said, quote, "Treason doth never prosper. What's the reason? Why, if it prosper, none dare call it treason," unquote. Victors, you see, always write the history books. The newly minted Americans and their descendants did not handle their newfound liberty well. The war ended in 1781, and just 8 years later, the infamous Constitution was foisted upon the unruly colonies. The Constitution did what its defenders ostensibly vowed it would not do: localize power and control in a central state. That's exactly what the Constitution did. It was all downhill from there, with Washington bureaucrats flexing their governmental muscle with the Alien and Sedition Act, which allowed imprisonment of people for speech critical of the federal government. Still to come was Lincoln's obscene war of Northern aggression, his brazen and bloody federal power grab, and the Great Depression, where the federal government, responsible for causing distress for the citizenry, took advantage of the monster they created to justify its ideology and social reengineering. The American Revolution was a mistake simply because the end result was less freedom. It did not take all that long for the colonists to devolve from living in an almost utopian existence, as far as liberty goes, to being subjects all over again, only to a much more heartless king with 1,000 faces. In presuming to throw off a non existent yoke of tyranny, we made ourselves slaves. We had not been liberated. We had been imprisoned, all now servants of a godless oligarchy whose sole reason for existence was and is to empower themselves at the expense of those it presumes to lord over. Americans who are not feasting at the government set table of taxpayer funded benefits must now work half the year to meet their tax obligations. If liberty is what the American values, consider we are not free to travel. We are not free to have a private conversation on our cell phones. We are not free to do as we wish with property we say we own. We are not free to drink raw milk. We are not free to do as we wish with regard to health care. We are not free to fish or hunt. We are not free to take money out of a bank. We are not free to carry firearms. We are not free to start a business without first getting permission. We are not free to rent a home to whomever we wish. We are not free to travel with cash. We are not free to fly the flag of our choosing. We are not free to speak our mind about sexual deviancy. We are not free to sell lemonade in our front yard. We are not free to collect rainwater. We are not free to have yard sales. We are not free to purchase a big gulp. The Declaration of Independence, inadvertently or not, made slaves of us all. And here we sit 246 years hence, shackled in the bonds of the godless American government. We are not free. We now live under the absolute fist of tyranny. There is no cause for celebration today, as the actions of the signers laid the foundation for the quickly budding new empire. In throwing off the non-tyrannical crown, thus creating a monster where there was none, they planted the seeds for what we have today, the sprouts beginning to show just 8 years after their faulty decision. Had you lived in 1775, would you have been a loyalist or a revolutionary? Before you answer, consider again living in an era where the central government exacted 1% of the nation's wealth. Consider living in an era where there was no income tax. Would you describe this as living under tyranny? The political answer for all this is for another essay to come. But for now, enjoy the festivities, the fireworks, the picnics, and the baseball games. But make sure you have a permit for all of it. You wouldn't want to celebrate without governmental authorization.